Okay, we're a little bit after 10 now, so I think we'll get going. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Sean Cooper. I'm a business analyst working on the MHHS design team, and today myself and a colleague, Alyssa Prislak, who's also a BA on the team, will be taking you through, I think the fourth. I think it's the fourth of these end-to-end walkthrough sessions that we've been running. This one focusing on metering related activities. As per the previous sessions, if anyone has got any questions as we're going through, then the place to raise these is on Slido using the hashtag MHHS, and I think I'm also joined by a couple of colleagues from the PPC who'll be sort of collating those questions, and what we'll do is try and tackle as many as we can at the end of the session. I think what I would also call out is that I think in 2 weeks' time we're also running a series of sort of surgery type sessions where there'll be sort of I think more more interactive Q&A type sessions. So again, if there's anything that comes up, following today's session, I'd keep your eye out for those. I think they're happening not next week, but the week after. So in terms of what we plan to cover off, what we plan to cover off today. So we'll be looking at metering changes, on-site site works activity, looking at perhaps an install and remove and an exchange. Alyssa's going to then cover off for us a quick walkthrough of the de-energization or change in energization. I think that's probably better described as change in energization process rather than de-energization. It's my fault. We'll have a quick look at the disconnection process, and then I'll spend some time talking about, I think, what is one of the more complicated bits of the MHHS design, which is a change of connection type and a change of segment. So we'll have a conversation about what both those two things are new concepts that have been brought in by MHHS. So we'll make sure that everyone's got an understanding of what those two data items are, and then we'll look at the processes around them, and then just to finish up, we'll have a very quick look at the update of sort of non-supplier maintained registration items, the vast majority of which are maintained by the LDSO. For those of you that were in the MPAN ownership meeting earlier on this week, we're gonna follow a sort of similar process to that, in that we'll have a little bit of a discussion or a slide or two on the on what we think of a high level, headlines, if you like, in terms of difference or things to call out about the process, and then we'll have a very quick whiz through the business process itself. I appreciate that trying to walk through business processes in detail over Teams and sort of when that's a one-way conversation isn't the best. So obviously, I'd urge people to take those processes away and look at them in more detail in their own time, and then. Just another reminder of the surgery sessions week after next, if there are any questions or queries that come out following your own review, and then hopefully we'll have a reasonable amount of time to deal with Slido questions at the end. I think the only thing, just before we sort of get get going again is to just a bit like the session on Tuesday. We weren't really planning on running through the interfaces in a huge amount of well, in any detail. So I would point people to the interface document that's up on collaboration SharePoint, and that covers all of the interfaces that we'll be talking about today. Goes down into the data item level, and there is another session that myself and a colleague, Rob Golding, did a few weeks ago, which sort of covers off the interfaces and the mechanics of the interface in a little bit more detail, and we'll publish these slides at the end of the session. So, change of metering. So this is business process 9, and I think apart from a few changes in the interface, I think this sort of the process isn't dissimilar to the way in which it works today, and it also follows the same sort of pattern as many of the MHHS sort of processes, in that a service provider will perform some actions. They will get sent into the registration system. The registration system will validate those updates and then publish the response back to the sending party, and then the wider group of participants as required. So hopefully there's nothing, hopefully we're following that same sort of pattern, and there's nothing particularly strange about these processes. Work would still be requested by the supplier and confirmed by the metering service using whatever the agreed mechanism is between them. We understand there's different suppliers and different metering services do this in different ways. I think some metering services offer a web portal, some people are still using telephone or email, and I think there's the D145, which would remain, which is also used for requesting work. During the workshop sessions that we had when we were looking at this, there was some suggestion that perhaps the D145 wasn't sort of completely fit for purpose, and there was some suggestion that could be replaced by a new DIP interface. That's still a possibility, but that's not in the baseline design as of today. So that if we were to go ahead with that, then that would be subject to a future change request. So D1. Sorry,
Sean, just to jump in, I think that's just a typo. It's the 142.
Sorry,
just to make that clear for everybody.
142. Yeah. Okay, yeah. Apologies, my fault. 142. And then we have, apologies for that, 142. So that's still 142 in the design, but there may be a future change request to sort of migrate that onto a DIP interface. In terms of recovery of half-hourly consumption, at the point of the meter exchange or a meter removal, again, this is sort of subject to whatever agreements a supplier will have in place with their service providers. So I'd say suppliers may have mechanisms whereby their metering service and or their data service can call in and request to the pole of the meter, sort of in the moments before it's taken off the wall. That as I said is entirely arrangement between the supplier and their agents. In terms of what's the minimum requirement of a metering service when on site, and that's effectively to capture and share a cumulative read for a smart meter, and then register readings as appropriate for traditional and advanced meters. As we mentioned before, sort of rule of thumb for meter readings comes into to play again, and the smart cumulative readings are exchanged over the DIP using interface 41, publication 41, and then meter technical details would be shared with all parties using pub 6. Traditional meter readings or register readings exchanged using a D10, and meter technical details exchanged using the 149-150. And then for advanced meters, again, readings exchanged using a D10, and the meter technical details using the 268. I think there's a process. Hopefully, got this D-flow right. 31312, whereby I think at the moment it's possibly suppliers and the metering service can effectively use that flow to maintain the historic metering data within registration. Again, I think after some discussion in the various working groups, it was decided that functionality should effectively be restricted to the metering service, since he will effectively has ultimate ownership of all the metering data. But there will be a mechanism whereby the appointed metering service will be able to correct or amend the meter history in the registration service if required. And then I think the last thing to call out before we look at the map is to, pardon the pun, is to talk about the maps, and they'll continue to be looped in with regard to what's happening in terms of movement of assets using the existing D303 and 304 D flows, and I believe there's a number of other ongoing initiatives, I think off the back of CSS and some other standalone initiatives going on that look to improve the visibility that maps get of what's happening around their assets more generally. So hopefully that covers off the map bit. So if we switch over and have a look at the actual business process. So bear me a second, just try and zoom in. So as you can see, this is correctly marked up as a 142. So I think the sort of early part of the process is pretty much the same as today. So we've got the supplier interacting with the metering service to request whatever work is required. And then once the metering service once the work date's reached and the metering service is on site, he would then effectively attempt to capture any additional half hourly data, again, as we said, in line with whatever processes or mechanisms he's agreed with the supplier. And he would complete the physical metering works, whether that's an exchange, removal, to adding a new meter. He would effectively complete the on-site activity. That activity may or may not be associated with a change in energization status. I think we'll come on to talk about that in a moment or two. But from an MHHS perspective, we consider these to be effectively separate events. So even though they may be happening, in the same visit or coincidentally in time, they would actually be treated as two separate events. So the metering service would follow the process that we're about to go through in order to notify the meter exchange, and then he would have to kick off a separate process to then deal with the change of energization status. In scenario, so here we have a slight divergence in the process depending on the nature of the metering on site. If we go down the sort of non-smart, so this would be traditional meters or advanced meters. I mean, this I think would work pretty similarly to the way in which it does today. As we said, for traditional meters, we'd have an exchange. They'd issue a 149/150 and a D10 with the with the appropriate install and remove readings. And then similarly for an advanced meter, they'd issue the 268, a D10, and then a D383 or 384 as appropriate, which I think are meter commissioning related flows. And those would all go via using existing flows via the DTN, and we would update the data service. Obviously needs to understand that a meter change has taken place. We'd also notify the LDSO and then back up here to the supplier. So hopefully that is all pretty straightforward. In terms of the non-smart route, we then effectively have sort of two channels of communication in the MHHS world. So we have the sending of the meter exchange via interface 05 into the registration service. So this sort of leg is dealing with the actual physical meter technical details. Metering service would send that through via the DIP to the registration service. The registration service would do some basic validation on that, making sure I'm not trying to, remove a meter before I've installed it and that sort of thing. And provided it passed that validation, it would then go on to publish that. So we, following this leg round, we go on to publish details of that meter exchange in a pub 06 to the interested party. So obviously the metering service would get confirmation of his acceptance back himself, and then that metering update would also go to the LDSO and obviously back to the supplier. In cases where that sort of validation by the registration service he's failed, or then that would result in obviously a rejection, then going back to the metering service, who'd have to investigate what the issue was and resubmit the corrected change. So that's the sort of path that the meter technical details will follow. In terms of the cumulative read, that would go via a separate interface 41 into the DIP, and then the DIP uses pub 41 then to share that meter reading again with all the same parties. So the data service, the LDSO and the supplier. And I think that's largely the process. I think the only other thing to call out is obviously once the supplier for a smart meter, supplier has received those revised meter technical, those revised meter technical details, he would need to go through a commission and configure type process with the DCC in order to formally get that meter set up in DCC. And we haven't, like I say, those processes are documented. And covered elsewhere. They're not changing as part of MHHS, so they'll remain as is. So I think that sort of covers the. I think that sort of covers off the. The metering activity. I think participants will have noticed these purple boxes that are peppered over some of the process maps, and they're trying to impart some additional information. So here, this box just referring to what happens with respect to the map. As we said, the metering service will continue to use the 303 and the 304 in order to communicate with the map as to what's happening with his asset. And here we're just calling. I think this note here is just calling out that we do appreciate that on some occasions, there will be emergency work undertaken by the DNO, and effectively the existing processes will be followed for the DNO to pass any activity that they've done through to the appropriate supplier and metering service, and then the metering service would trigger these activities off the back of the advisory information from the LDSO. So, as I say, hopefully that gives us a good overview of this particular process. So if we come on to change of energization status, again, I think much of the upfront interaction between the supplier, MOP, and the LDSO, if required, continues to use the existing D-flows. I think, as Alyssa will come on to show us in a minute, I think the main change is that responses, either in terms of a failed job, so a job that couldn't go ahead, or confirmation of the changes, those, the result of the work will flow via the DIB. As we said with the meter exchange, any attempt recovery of half-hourly data will be subject to the arrangements each supplier has in place with their various service providers. And again, the minimum requirement on the metering service is to capture a cumulative read when dealing with a smart meter, or register readings when dealing with TRAD and advanced meters. And I think, again, as I called out when we were walking through the last map, if a metering activity is combined with a change in energization status, then that's absolutely fine in terms of the on-site activity, but effectively they would then be treated as two separate events from an MHHS perspective. So, are you all right, Alyssa, to give us a quick, just give everyone an overview of the diagram? But you all right to walk us through it, Liz?
Yes.
I'll try and zoom in again. Yeah. Is that better? Is that enough?
Great. Thank you. So, as Sean mentioned, we have the existing D-flows for supply to notify the LDSO or metering services that a change of energization is required. For the LDSO, once the energization change has happened, they will actually notify metering services going forward. They won't be contacting supply directly. They will forward that on to metering services, so metering services can actually update the registration service. Thank you. Once metering services has received the energisation change request, they will complete the activity. As Sean mentioned, as a minimum, capture the cumulative reads, or where possible, they will send D10s. For non-smart, they will capture the energisation change, the change of energisation read, and send that on to the data service and onto the data service, and then they'll action the change. If where prepayment change of energisation is required, metering services will actually send the D179 back to supply to notify of all the debt information. Where metering services are unable to take action, or the request is actually rejected, they will send an interface 07 via the DIP back to registrations. And that will just go back to supply, so nobody else will be aware, and then supply can take action and either re-request or whatever supply need to do that with the existing process as today. For UMS, they will actually get a request from supplies, from the customer or the LDSO that there's been a change in energisation. They will do the logical change, and they will send in interface 07 as per the rest of the metering services. It will all go into registrations for registrations to be able to update the energisation status. Once that will go through the DIP into registrations, and registrations will do some basic validation. And if you could just scroll up a little bit, Sean. Yeah, so any successful change in registrations will go into any successful change of energisation will go into registrations. Registrations will do some validation to make sure that the energisation status and all the metering details are aligned. Once that's updated, if it's successful, it will then go through to the DIP and it will be published to all services. So that will go to the LDSO, to the data service, to ECS to notify them of a change in energisation, and to data services. If that's rejected, once registrations has done its checks, if the energisation change is rejected, that will go directly back to metering services, who will need to make any amendments to make sure that that change is then resubmitted successfully. And that's the end of the process.
Cheers, Alyssa. Thanks for that. So again, hopefully we've given you hopefully that's given you a flavour of how that process works. I think, as we've said, with all of these maps, you're obviously going to want to spend your own time looking over them in a lot more detail than we can do them justice on a call like this. So okay, we move on. We've got next one is disconnection. So again, you'll be spotting a bit of a theme here in that, again, a number of the upfront deflows associated with this process are retained, but the back end, or the result of the outcome, is communicated via the DIP. I think following CSS implementation, disconnections effectively sort of become a bit of almost a two-stage process in that effectively we'll have disconnection recorded at the LDSO, as was sort of always the case, but now we have this additional step of then needing to sort of deactivate or deregister the MPAN in CSS. And I think we're calling out that, again, a lot of discussion in the working groups around who should get told what as part of this process, but where the consensus landed was that only suppliers would get notified about the LDSO disconnection event. Service providers won't actually be told. Well, I say won't actually be told. The way that some service providers will be told there's a disconnection is effectively through auto de-appointment with a reason code of disconnection. Once the registration service has had confirmation from CSS that the MPAN has been killed off, deactivated, no longer required. The registration service will also then formally confirm to suppliers and Electron Central Systems settlements that the MPAN has been deregistered in CSS, and that'll be via Pub 09. So are you okay to talk us through this one, Alice?
Yeah.
Disconnection, there we go. I'll try and zoom in again. Give me a second. Is that all right?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Sean. So for suppliers, to initiate the disconnection, they first need to follow the change of meter and the change of energization, because we need to have the meter removed and the meter to be the site to be de-energized at registrations for the disconnection to take place. Once that's completed, they can send a 132 into the LDSO to request that meter point is then disconnected. If the LDSOs reject this, they will send back a 262 to supply, and supply need to manage that rejection as they would today. If the LDSO accepts the disconnection, they will send an internal DBO3 into registrations to have that disconnected. Registrations will then update the systems to show as disconnected, and they will send out interface 09 into the DIP, who will then send out a Pub 09 to confirm back to supply and the LDSO that the disconnection is now successful in registrations. If you could go to the left, Sean.
Yep, sorry. Yeah.
That's all right. And scroll down a bit. So for unmetered supplies, so they will receive notification from either the LDSO from the customer supplier, or it can be an UMSO disconnected set request. So the UMSO will email or via another agreed mechanism let the LDSO know this needs to be disconnected, and that could have come direct from the supply through a UMS, or it can be a UMS rejection, and vice versa. So LDSOs can notify the UMS that this is being disconnected. Where the LDSOs need to disconnect, this is where they will take the action, is they will just disconnect the meter point there. If LDSOs get a customer request at step 54, is they will take the necessary action. So again, if they need to remove the meter, obviously they'll follow the meter exchange, and if they need to de-energize, they'll follow the change of energization process, and they will disconnect at that point at points to 60. If you could scroll to the right, please, Sean. Thank you. So once the suppliers receive the disconnection, if you could scroll to the top. Thank you. Is they will need to send in, if it isn't a logical disconnection and they need to fully disconnect, they will need to send the CS1900 to CSS to deregister the MPAN. Once that's received, CSS will send in a notification to registrations to confirm that has been deregistered. and that will start the auto de-appointment process. So as soon as it's deregistered, registrations will send interface 09 into the DIP, which will then issue out that it's been deactivated to the DNOs and to ECS, and it will de-appoint and notify everybody of the relevant de-appointment. So it will update the supplier, the LDSOs, metering service, and data service to confirm that they've been that they are de-appointed with a reason of disconnection.
Cheers, Alyssa. That's great. Thank you. Just jump back to my deck. Okay, so next we are going to look at change of connection type and or change of segment. And I think as I mentioned in the introduction, both these are sort of new concepts for introduced as part of market-wide half hourly. So the connection type is a data item that's owned and maintained within the registration service, but it's owned and maintained by the LDSO, and is effectively a sort of description of the physical connection, if you like. So it's describing whether something is whole current, whether it's a CT type arrangement, obviously with different levels of voltage, or whether it's unmetered. So its connection type is really, as I said, maintained in the registration service by the LDSO, and is a kind of a physical, it relates to the physical supply that's in place. And then market segment is a dynamic or derived data item that's calculated or determined by the registration service. Hopefully you're all familiar with the market segments, but we've got smart including traditional, advanced, and unmetered, and the way in which the registration service will determine what segment an MPAN should reside in is by effectively using the ISD tables to look up meter type and connection type, and the combination of meter type and connection type should drive it to a valid market segment. And then what that also should then do is lead to should also point to whether the service providers appointed to that MPAN are compatible. So, are the service providers, accredited or registered to operate in that particular market segment. So hopefully that sort of explains these two new data items. I think the change of market segment connection type process can be somewhat complicated, and obviously there are a range of different scenarios. If we look first of all at perhaps one of the easier types of scenario, which would be a change in connection type. So perhaps I'm going from an LVCT to a HVCT, and actually I don't need a change of meter in order to make that change. Then we just have to worry about coordinating the on-site activity of the LDSO to come and change the physical connection, the metering service to temporarily disconnect or reconnect or change whatever ancillary devices might be there associated with the meter, and then to action the required changes on the same day, which is what we sort of refer to in the process documents and the requirements as the target work date. So, and then assuming that the work goes ahead, the LDSO will then update the connection type, and the register off the back of, so LDSO will update the connection type from, in our example here, from LVCT to HVCT, and off the back of that will issue a pub 43, which is, notice of change of connection type. The registration service will then automatically, as we said, market segments are calculated or derived field. So the registration service will automatically reevaluate the market segment, identify that there's no change. So again, in our particular example here, there's actually just a change in connection type and no change in segments. Both sit within the advanced. Both would sit within the advanced segment, and therefore the existing advanced service providers are still appropriate. And so there's no need for any kind of change of agent or change of service provider or anything like that. However, there may or may not be a change in GWOS tariff ID, and if there was, that would come out in pub 18. But we'll look at those changes in a bit more detail later on. So what we are trying to communicate with this sort of easier scenario is that really we've just got a change in, all we need to worry about is a change in connection type, and introduce this concept of automated reevaluation of the market segment, and we can look at that in a bit more detail on this map here. So if I just try and zoom in on this a little. So the supplier identifies that there's a change of connection type, required, or the customer's requested change in connection type, and then he goes on to arrange that work with the LDSO, and that interaction will happen in the same way as it does at the moment. And again, I think probably different LDSOs may have different mechanisms, either via email or web forms or whatever, but this process will remain the same as it is today, and the supplier will effectively agree a target work date with the LDSO. He'll also, and what is sort of shown in grey is that obviously there may or may not be a change of metering required as well, but assuming there was, then the supplier would obviously need to agree and put in place, whatever support was required from the metering service for that same day. In our example here, we're saying that the existing service providers are compatible with, so the service providers appointed before the connection type change will still be valid after the connection type change, because we're not changing segment. Both the LVCT and the HVCT, both in the advanced segment, so we don't need to worry about agent compatibility. So obviously all of this is being done in advance, and we then effectively get to the target work date, the day that the work's going to complete on site. Excuse me. If for any reason that work doesn't go ahead, then obviously that would be fed back to the supplier, who would then need to look to rearrange the work. Assuming that the work did go ahead, the LDSO would then update the firstly issue the commissioning flows if required, but then also more importantly update the registration service to effectively say that a new connection type was now in place, and then following that update, the registration service may or may not kick off a change in Duos tariff ID, but it will always trigger market segment reevaluation, which sort of feeds into this next sort of process that we have here. So if we sort of follow this through for our current example, so we've got a connection. So for our example, it would be triggered by a connection type change. The registration system would reevaluate the market segment. So we would do that, look at the meter type I had and the connection type I had, and say, is that a valid connection, valid combination? In our case, it will be. It will also then say, has that change resulted in a change of segment? In our case, it won't have done. And at that point, it would then issue the change in connection type notification to both the supplier and then all the other interested parties. So the supplier, the metering service, data service, and Elexon Central Systems, and the supplier, obviously both service providers and Elexon Central Systems. And that's sort of, in terms of our scenario, that's where that process would then effectively end. So hopefully hopefully that sort of covers off the sort of easier scenario. So again, so hopefully that covers off the easiest scenario. People are still with me, because we have things kind of get a little bit more. I was going to put scary, but I think perhaps complex is the better phrase. So now, if you consider perhaps a more complicated situation whereby we have a change of connection type, but we've also that's also going to result in both a definite change of metering and also a change of segment. So perhaps an example might be moving from, let's say, a smart whole current type arrangement to an LVCT type arrangement. And that, as we said, would result in a change of segment from smart to advanced. And there we have to worry about coordinating, several different process elements. Obviously, the LDSO needs to action the changes on site and then update the connection type. The metering service needs to obviously perform the meter exchange and then update that into send the updates of that meter exchange into the registration service. And we've also got the added complication of we know that the current smart service providers that are in place, the metering service and data service, won't be compatible with the segment of the new arrangement. So we're going to have to put in place new advanced service providers. So if we try and walk through that, in a similar sort of stepped way, first of all, perhaps just using some bullets here, and then we'll run through the processes again. So exactly the same as before. The supplier will need to agree the target work date with both the LDSO and the incoming metering service. So effectively, the metering service that's going to fit and be responsible for that advanced, incoming or new to be installed advanced meter. And he'll also need to ensure that there are accepted prospective appointments in place in advance of the target work date for service providers that are able to that are compatible with the with that advanced meter. So effectively, he would need to be putting in place appointments with the new metering service and the new advanced data service, with appointment start dates that aligned with the target work date. And you should also set, for those of you that when you look at the actual interface for setting up an appointment, there's an appointment reason code in there, and one of the values for that is seg. And we would also set the value of effectively set the appointment reason code as seg, and we'll come on to why that might be important a bit later on. So if we assume that the work goes ahead, then we have this sort of 2 working day window after the following the target work date for quite a few things need to happen in tandem. So the LDSO needs to update the connection type, and the registration needs to update the connection type, and the registration service will issue a pub 43 changing connection type notice. The metering service will also need to update the registration with details of the meter exchange via the process that we went through earlier on. Excuse me. The prospective, and then the prospective advanced service provider notifications that we'd sort of put in place, they also need to become active, which would result in spitting out the registration service spitting out a pub 36, and that was the process that we went through last Tuesday on the change or appointment of service provider process. So effectively, I've got the complexity comes because I've effectively got all three of these processes needing to happen in tandem, and ideally coming together, or ideally all having completed within a 2 working day window following the completion of the work. Again, as before, the registration service will then reevaluate the market segment and identify if and in this case, it'll identify that there has also been a change in market segment as well as connection type. So in this example, would also issue out a pub 44, which is notification of a change in market segment. So I'll get 2 notifications from the registration service, one saying your connection type's changed, great, and then another saying that the market segment has changed. Yeah, so in doing that reevaluating of the market segment, in our example here, we will have made sure that there were service providers appropriate for the segment in place by virtue of our advanced appointments. So again, in this particular example, there will be no action taken vis-a-vis service providers, but again, we'll look in a moment about what might happen if the supplier, in scenarios when the supplier perhaps hasn't been able to put those appointments in place. So I know this is complicated, and no doubt we'll end up having many more discussions around this particular process, both in the surgery next week and I'm sure either in face-to-face workshops maybe, or other sessions online. So I appreciate this is complicated, and so I think there will inevitably be further sessions where we go through this process, where we look at an even wider range of different scenarios, and obviously I'd urge participants to go and to try and get their heads around this by looking at the various business process maps and registration requirements as well will also provide a bit of an insight into this. So again, if we go back to the process now, bearing in mind our sort of more complex scenario. So in this case, again, in this case, we'll be obviously needing to arrange the connection type to go from smart whole current connection type to a LVCT connection type. In this case, in our second example here, this line here wouldn't be grey. We would need the metering service to we would need our prospective metering service here to be on site and fitting that new advanced meter, and then in doing so he'd be following the change of metering process that we went through earlier. So again, if we assume that the work is complete or complete successfully, this is where, and once that work's completed, we're saying this is when our this sort of 2-day window. So effectively, we've got 2 working day window for both the LDSO to do this process of updating the connection type, and also for the metering service to get details of his exchange into registration. And then if we follow this process through for our new scenario, so we've had so we will have had a change in connection type and a change of metering, so it would have been triggered off the back of both of those. So in our example, we'll assume that both updates have been completed successfully. So actually, I have got a valid combination of connection type and meter type, because the LDSO's updated the connection type to reflect that it's LVCT. The metering service has submitted his meter exchange, so now he's got an advanced meter type. So I've got a valid arrangement in terms of that combination, and the registration service is able to identify that, yes, I used to be smart and now I'm advanced, therefore it would go down the route of saying that the segment had changed, and at this point it would then issue the change in segment notification, and again, because of then it would go on to evaluate the apologies, I was making a quick note to myself, a tweak that needs to be made there. So Then it would go on to evaluate whether the service providers were appropriate for this new segment, and because the supplier had put in place those advance appointments, those had completed and become active. So again, there's no activity that's required there. And essentially the process is then completed. I say I appreciate this is even the easiest scenarios are relatively is relatively bemusing, because these are new processes, new concepts, and as I say, as we get into the more complex setups, and where things we'll look in a moment at where things perhaps don't go right and the implications of that. We will. I don't want people to worry that if I haven't managed to land this with you today, I'm confident that there were going to be many more sessions around this particular process. But hopefully I've made a reasonable stab at sort of introducing some of the basic concepts at least. If we look at some of the things that might, what are some of the I'm trying to say, what are some of the things that might go wrong or might happen during this process? So, what if the LDSO or the metering service failed to perform their updates? And I think the key thing here with this, with a change, with these changes, is that yes, there are responsibilities on the LDSO and the metering service individually, but I think the requesting supplier it needs to be managing and monitoring that end-to-end process. So ultimately, the supplier has responsibility to make sure that all the steps are processed successfully. So, for example, if you can see that I don't know, a day and a half. 2 days have passed, and one of the updates, either the LDSO update or the metering service update, is missing, then the supplier should be trying to proactively get onto their service provider or the LDSO and chase them and say, what's happening with this update. As soon as one of the updates is received, and I'm not proposing to go through it on the map, but if you take the time to track through on the map, you'll identify that as soon as one of the updates in our scenario received, what would actually happen is that the registration service would detect that there was an invalid combination of meter type and connection type. So if we think about our example that we've just been through, let's say that the LDSO had updated the connection type from whole current to LVCT, but the metering service had been a little bit tardy in sending he hasn't yet sent in his meter exchange. At that point, if the segment was reevaluated at that point, I would now end up with a mismatch, because the connection type's been changed. That's showing as LVCT, but I've now still got a smart. The meter type is still showing as a smart meter type. That's an invalid combination. So what the registration service would do in that scenario is to say, well, okay, I know a change in segment must be coming, so I will automatically de-appoint the invalid old service providers. Oops, apologies. I think it's also worth noting that the market segment there's sort of no concept of an invalid market segment, if you like. The market segment will remain set as the old market segment. So in our example would remain set as smart until such time as the registration service is able to determine a new valid status, if that makes sense. And It's also worth calling out that during this period, the supplier will receive registration service registration reminders to say either that there is an invalid combination between meter type and connection type, or perhaps if the old smart service providers have already been deappointed, then they would also receive a notification that there were no service providers appointed for this particular MPRN. Sorry, MPAN. So what happens if the LDSO or metering service doesn't perform their updates even after so they've now broken their SLA, if you like, their time period. And there is actually, we've built in something of a grace period, if you like, because what happens is the registration system is actually configured to allow 5 working days. So we want to be completely clear that the expectation is that this should, in 99% of the time, be completed within 2 working days, but we accept that there's always, perhaps if it was off the back of a bank holiday or an Easter weekend, or there is a degree of grace period. But effectively what would happen at this point is that the prospective appointments that the supplier had in place would effectively lapse, and then would need to be reissued by the supplier once both parties had performed their updates. So it really is, again, in the supplier's interest to make sure that both his agents, be it the LDSO or the metering service, are working to those timescales. What would happen if the supplier hadn't put in place those advance appointments, or, as we've said, that they might have become lapsed? Well, effectively, as we've said, the registration service would detect that there was a change in segment ongoing, would deappoint the old service providers, and then the supplier would need to reissue their service appointments, but this time they would be putting in a retrospective start date in line with whatever the actual work date was. What if you did this process and you didn't set the appointment type to SEG, as we mentioned earlier on? I mean, the effect of that would effectively be that is the mechanism the registration service is using to give us this 5-day grace period. So you'll remember from our session on Tuesday that prospective appointments effectively sit in the queue, waiting to be matched up with an incoming secured active. In this case, our appointments are effectively sat there waiting to be matched up with a connection, with the change in connection type on change in meter type. And under normal circumstances, the appointments would effectively be lapsed if the conditions weren't met on the actual appointment start date set in the flow. So basically, SEG is the mechanism by which we say, okay, we won't kill this appointment off as soon as the appointment start date is reached. We'll give it another 5 working days before at which point the registration service would lapse it. If the work doesn't go ahead, then effectively, those appointments that the supplier had put in place would, as we've just said, they would get to the appointment start date, what was the original planned work date. The condition, because the work never happened, there has been no connection type change, there has been no meter exchange, so the criteria and for those appointments to become active is not met, and effectively they would just lapse. If the target work date is rescheduled, then as we said earlier, the supplier would need to then reissue new proposed appointments for the new target work date. Oh, sorry, that's like I'm answering a different question there. Saying target work date is scheduled to coincide with an SSD. Yeah. So there's nothing in the design that prevents an incoming supplier scheduling work to take place on their anticipated SSD, and I think that's the case in the current world today. However, that supplier would obviously need to take responsibility to make sure any such works were cancelled in the event that his switch was no longer going ahead. So if it was objected to or cancelled or whatever. You'd be pleased to know we're coming towards the back end of this now. Last one. So if a supplier acquires an MPAN where there is this mismatch or misalignment of connection type and market segment, our expectation is that this should be incredibly rare. It would seem to be sort of counterintuitive for a customer to be agreeing what are relatively complicated and expensive works on the one hand, and then randomly changing supplier right in the middle of it on the other. However, if it did ever end up happening, unfortunately, it's going to be the acquiring or the incoming supplier that's sort of going to be, holding the baby, unfortunately, for want of a better phrase. And he's going to then have to sort of liaise with the previous supplier, previous LDSO, and the various sets of service providers to try and figure out what's gone on, what's gone on site, and what's failed to happen. There could be a range of different circumstances there, but regretfully, it would be that incoming supplier that's sort of left sort of to try and figure out what's the best way forward. And obviously he's not going to be able to do that without liaising with the other interested parties. So just to finish up on connection, on change of market segment and connection type, you'd be pleased to know that I don't expect you to read this, and I'm not going to go through it now today. But I just wanted to try and recontextualize what has been a bit of a complicated thing. But effectively, change of market segment, change of connection type is I've really just got three processes happening at the same time. And this map, which you'll find in the bundle, it's BP11A, effectively glues them all together and puts them all on one page. And at first sight, it is a little bit scary, but if we just break it down into, I agree the work, I identify that the work's required, I agree the work, and I set a target work date. I put in place my prospective appointments for my new my 2B segment. So I put in place my prospective appointments. The LDSO performs on site and then updates the connection type. The metering service makes the exchange on site and then updates the meter exchange. And then all of that comes together within that 2 working day period, and the appointments are made active, and the process is completed. So I think perhaps hopefully when you dissect it down into its sort of component parts, it isn't quite as complicated, and hopefully you can see how it sort of joins together. So then that's sort of a little bit ahead of time, but that just leaves us with update of registration data items. As I said in the introduction, this is predominantly this is data items that are owned and maintained by the LDSO, or one case the CSS. So we're effectively looking at change of meter point address, change of GSP, change of the import export MPAN linkage, which we spoke about on Tuesday, a change in the configuration of related MPANs, or a change in GEOS tariff ID or LLF ID. So I think all of those are effectively LDSO maintained data items. The change of domestic indicator is included in this one because it's received the changes are received into registration from CSS. So it seemed sensible to include that here rather than in the set that we spoke about on Tuesday, which were sort of directly under the supplier control. Yes, obviously the supplier is managing and setting this in CSS, but the way in which the MHHS world is notified would be via this publication 18. We've also included change of energy direction and metered indicator. Now, in theory, these should never change. They should be set. They'll be set at the point of MPAN creation, and they, in theory, they should never change. However, we understand there is a kind of convention whereby to fix administrative errors or things like that, there is a mechanism for a one-off change. So obviously, if depending on when that one-off change was actually spotted and corrected, then there may be a requirement to notify the parties if they were already if they'd already been communicated to the value had been set in a particular way and then it was being changed. So just wanted to give that a bit of context. But effectively, all of these follow exactly the same pattern. That the registration service is updated either directly or via. Understand that LDSOs have these DB flows that they can send in that affect change, or we've got the update coming from CSS. But effectively, registration service is updated, and then MHHS participants are notified via the DIP using pub 18. We can have a quick look at one. Example, or a couple of examples, if you want. But they're all effectively following the same pattern. So here, there's an update to the address, either triggered by the update to the address and or GSP. And that could be triggered by the LDSO, and that's notified into the registration service. We understand address changes might also come from CSS, and there's a mechanism for feeding those into the registration service already. So effectively, registration service is updated with a change, and then that change triggers out an interface 18 into the DIP, and then a pub 18 out to whatever MHHS participants are interested in that particular change. I wasn't going to go through them all. They all follow. They're all effectively a carbon copy of this arrangement. Registration, as I said, registration's updated by whatever mechanism. assuming that update was successful, the publication is then sent. Pub 18 is then sent out to the interested parties, and that same pattern is replicated for each of the changes that we've called out here. And I think that's basically us for today. I just call out, I think, just like I did at the end of the session on Tuesday, all of the metering related stuff that we've gone through today. So this deck and the various business processes and business process descriptions are all on the kind of in the metering folder on the collaboration base or on the SharePoint site. Again, I'd urge people to have a look not only at the business processes, but the supporting requirements documentation, because the requirements sometimes do add a kind of another level of detail and understanding that perhaps isn't able to be conveyed in just a plain reading of the process maps. And then I think that's us. So I don't know, PPC colleagues, have we got many questions?
Thank you, Sean, for that brilliant overview. Obviously, we do have lots of questions coming in.
I thought we might.
So thank you, everyone who sent them in. Luckily, we've got a bit of time to go through them, which is great. But any that we don't go through, we will be adding to the design FAQ, which is available on both the website and the collaboration base. And that is being regularly updated as we make our way through these design playback sessions. And these slides and recordings will also be made available on the website and the collaboration base for you to peruse in your own time. So Sean, we have a few highly voted questions, so I'll go through them at the beginning. Okay. Two of them seem to be slightly contradictory, so I'll just note both of them and ask you to comment on them. One is BP09 shows suppliers getting MTDs via legacy D-flows for non-smart and advanced meters. But what about smart meters? The map does not show this path. And then separately, we've got D149, D150, D313 will all need to be issued for non-half-hourly advanced meters and D268s for half-hourly. Why is this not shown? Are you able to comment on that?
Okay, there's quite a bit to do there. So the first one we're saying is, I think if I sort of strip it back, basically how are meter technical details shared for smart customers, I think is basically the gist of it.
Yeah.
And so the way that's done is that the metering service, having done the exchange on site, would send interface 05 into the registration service. The registration service would do some rudimentary validation, just making sure, like as we said, I'm not not trying to remove a meter before I'm installed it and things like that. But this is assuming the registration service passes that validation, then it would be via this Pub 06 that the meter technical details were shared for smart. So I hope, I don't know, and that Pub 06 goes to all the interested parties. So obviously, handshake back to the metering service to say, yes, I've actioned your meter exchange, and then it would also go on to the data service and back to the supplier. So I don't know whether, hopefully that answers that question. In terms of the second one, do you
want me to repeat it?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so looking at D-flows, D149, D150 and D313, they'll need to be issued for non-half-hourly advanced meters and D268s for half-hourly. Why is this not shown?
I think it is shown. So this is I'll have to go and double remind myself what a 313 is, but here we have the 149, 150 being shared for 149, 150 and a D10 being shared for the non-smart, and again that goes to all the interested parties, the data service, the supplier, and I think is it LDSO, yeah. And then here, similarly, for the advanced, we've got the 268 and the D10 going out there. I would have to go and remind myself what a 313 is. Yeah. Oh, here we go. Got the link here. So a lot of this stuff, I'd have to go and on the 313. I would need to go and double check with colleagues, but I think a lot of this stuff is now in the 268. But let me double check on the 313 issue.
That's fine, thanks, Sean. And we can follow this up in our FAQ as well.
Sean, sorry to interrupt. There is a note in the section at the bottom there that does confirm what you've just stated. 313 no longer required.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, 313 no longer required. There you go. Cool. Thank you.
Michael. It's very kind. Very helpful. Thank you. You can join the team. One from Mark Agnew. This is more of a comment, but it's just saying disconnections can occur with meters still on site. For example, the demolition of a block of flats, and this needs to be catered for. Is that something that?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously preference would usually be to recover the asset, except if they're old, they may just end up in the rubble. But usually the preference would be to recover the asset. But yeah, I don't think. I think our process, there's going to be funny, there's going to be sort of special cases around all of the processes really. But so yes, except the meter may not always be physically recovered, but I think you'd still probably you would have perhaps still gone through the process of maybe logically removing it and de-energizing the site maybe. Yeah.
Thank you, Sean. A couple on the disconnection process. One is, if the disconnection was made in error, can there be a process to reverse or unwind the disconnection?
I think. Have you got any thoughts on that one, Liz?
Well, at the moment they use a MAP04.
It's MAP04, is it? Okay.
Yeah.
So we'll need to take that one. I think we'll need to take that one away. So effectively, MAP04 at the moment is a manual it's a manual process between the supplier and the LDSO. I think those MAP processes are due to come to an end as a result of another change. So perhaps that's one for us to take away and pop on our thinking list.
Fab, thank you. And just a reminder for anyone with their hands up, you can submit questions via the Slido. If it's a follow-up to one of your questions that's been answered, then please let us know. You're very welcome to speak. Just carrying on. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, it's Mark Agnew. On the question about the reversal, once you go from disconnected to deactivated on CSS. Once it's deactivated, it's dead, never to return.
Yeah.
So the supplier gets told of a disconnection. He then has to agree with the disconnection, and if he agrees, he sends the flow to CSS. At that point, it's deactivated, never comes back. Or he can say to the DNO, "No, that's wrong," and they have a conversation. But the MAP04 bit has gone. It's already gone.
Yeah. Thank you. Looking at DNO disconnections as well on it, where is the process for DNO/customer disconnections, D352 being sent to supply? question mark, DNO will only carry out the disconnection once payment has been made. Where is the process for the DNO customer?
So we've recognised there is a customer initiated disconnection. I think, what was that flow again? Did you say
D352?
D352. Again, if you leave, I don't know. Have you got an immediate recollection of the conversations we've had around the 352 list, or do we need to take that one away and double check?
Yeah, no, we can double check on that.
Yeah, the reason I'm hesitant on these is some of these, the disconnection, de-energization, these processes were some of the first we looked at. So these were sort of agreed within the workshop, sort of, I don't know, just before Christmas, just after Christmas. So we'd have to go back and refresh our memories as to what was discussed around the 352. So leave that one with us.
And just kind of on that theme, we've got one round saying a supply can be simultaneously de-energized and disconnected. This doesn't seem to have been considered. Is that part of the same conversation?
I'm not sure there's anything in our process that would stop that per se. I don't think. But yeah, leave that one with so simultaneous de-energization and disconnection.
Okay, we'll move on from disconnection for a bit. This question, does this mean that updating ES, I'm wondering if that's EES, on echoes will no longer be the responsibility of the supplier? It's currently done via the D205.
That's energization. Yeah.
So so the 205 is gone, or is not used in the in the MHHS world. So yeah, the energization status as a data item would be owned and maintained by the metering service. So the metering service would be interacting, sending updates into registration to maintain the energization status, and then obviously whatever's held in registration would feed through to EES or ECOs as was. So I suppose the answer is yes. It's the metering service that is now responsible for ensuring the accuracy of the energization status. And so if there was any dispute about that, the supplier would need to contact their metering service and raise a query. I think we have suggested a number of possible interactions or new interactions that might be populated into STEP, and I think there's going to be some perhaps separate conversations around those as part of consequential change, but effectively, yeah, the supplier would need to query with the metering service if there was any dispute about the energization status.
Brilliant, thanks, Sean. Will a MAP 04 or equivalent process remain to be able to rectify errors disconnected in error type situation? So,
as I alluded to before, I put my hands up, I'm not mega close to the detail on this, but our understanding was that that sort of MAP process for maintaining certain things was sort of being wound up as part of a sort of separate change, separate to MHHS. So perhaps we can clarify exactly what's happening there. But yes, there will need to be, as we just said, similarly, as we just said, between the supplier and the metering service about queries around energization status, there will need to be interactions between the supplier and the LDSO about data items that the LDSO is responsible for. As I said, we've suggested that some of those, we've identified what we think are the kind of big ticket interactions that might be required between MHHS PIs, and we've suggested that those go into STEP. But as I said, that will be consequential change, so that's not sort of directly for us to deliver. That would be as part of the consequential change package, which will be discussed separately.
So not directly within scope, but something that we are sort of considering and discussing with participants.
Correct, yeah. And if those F-step proposals don't get taken forward, well, then I think as a programme, we would need to come back and sort of say, well, okay, you know, it's going to be email or whatever. But hopefully we can go down the S-step route, because that's kind of what it was there for, really.
Yeah, all right, brilliant, thank you. I've got one that I think our esteemed colleague Simon might want to answer. This is, are there expected to be any impacts on MAP participants as part of the MHHS programme? They're not present on the process maps, so I'm assuming not.
Thanks, Marina. Yes, the BSc doesn't recognise maps, so it's never really been part of the TOM. But I have been speaking to Carmen, who's the chair of the CMAP, because we think, as with Sean just mentioned there might be a consequential impact from changes to some of the data flows and information that maps get from Electrolink as a commercial activity. But again, it's something that we've been made aware of. The discussions are going on with Carmen, and it will get picked up, as Sean mentioned, through that consequential change process.
Mm-hmm. Brilliant, thank you. Very helpful.
I think I'd just add that there are poor old maps. They can never get quite enough data, can they? So there is already there's the 303 and 304, which we would expect the metering service to carry on using. So their map updates and well, yeah, I think there's functionality off the back of CSS as well. So yeah, they've got to actually use some of this stuff.
Yeah.
From maps to MOPs, will previous MOPs also be able to make changes to any meters that were installed during their effective period, or will it just be the current MOP?
So again, there was some discussion around this in the working group, and we felt where we landed was that we felt that it was appropriate. We felt it was appropriate to restrict it to the currently appointed metering service. So only the currently appointed metering service would be able to maintain the history. However, inevitably there's going to be, there would need to be interaction between the current metering service and the previous metering service, or maybe the supplier acts as broker between the current metering service and the previous metering. So there would need to be, if I'm sort of having a conversation or a discussion around what did or didn't happen on site, in previous months, you would have thought that there would have been some dialogue between the interested parties. But all that said, yes, at the moment it would only be the current, the appointed metering service that could do that history update. In fact, the only two kind of exceptions to that are that there's a slight window where we're allowing an outgoing metering service to still perform an exchange or an update. So, for example, I did some work on metering service. Did some work on a Monday. There was a change of service provider on a Tuesday, and then I didn't get a chance to get my flow out of the door before there was a change in metering service. So there's an allowance there to say, okay, the previous metering service can, for a X day window, still make current changes, if you like. So add, remove, exchange, and then the only other sort of exception to the rule that we have is around the process we talked through today, where we're effectively saying that we would allow, in the case of a change of segment, we would allow that incoming metering service to update the meter exchange in advance, or potentially in advance of his appointment becoming active. But there's safeguards in place to make sure that A, he's appointed, and that a seg is ongoing.
Fab. Okay, thank you. Just really quickly on the SEG term, we've had a note saying, please could we consider using another term other than SEG to avoid confusion with Smart Export Guarantee. So we'll just have to look at terminology there. On the MOP processes, what happens if the meter exchange has happened before migration to half hourly, but suppliers have not been updated by current MOP processes? Is that something we expect to happen?
Sorry, say that one again.
Sorry, what happens if the meter exchange has happened before migration to half hourly, but suppliers have not been updated by the current MOP processes?
Yeah, so I think that's when this kind of little grace period would come into play. And you know, as best you can, I know it's difficult, but you know, as best you can, you'd expect suppliers to be sort of not migrating customers into MHHS at the same time they were aware that there was potential metering activity ongoing, but except you don't always know that. So I think that's where this grace period would come in. So as long as the old outgoing MOP was doing his updated quote unquote timely fashion, I think we've set the window as about 10 working days. So as long as you know the sort of delayed exchange was notified within a reasonably timely fashion, then I think it would just fall into that category of an update by a previous MOP.
Okay, thank you, Sean. One on meter technical details. How will the supplier receive meter technical details for a smart meter?
So I think we covered that one. It would be via Purbo 6.
That's the Purbo 6, right? Fab.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Please could you confirm the process for smart remote changes, which previously sent D367 with associated D10s? Looking at the change of metering covered physical exchange, apparently. Do you want me to ask that one again?
367. Yeah, sorry, go on. Yeah, just
please could you confirm the process for smart remote changes, which previously sent D367 with associated D10s?
We'll have to double check on that. I think we put our hands up here. I think we copped out a little bit in just putting these two holding boxes in and saying it's the existing process, but let's leave. So D367 and D10s, we'll double check on that and come back with an answer.
Fab, no worries, we'll follow that up. Thank you very much. And then one on operational choreography. We've obviously been working on that. Are there operational choreography documents for these processes, as due to their complexity, the timings of the flows and actions are really important?
These I believe should be covered in the operational choreography document, or at least they should. So my understanding is that there should be, even if it's only sort of a sentence or a paragraph covering these sort of hard timelines that we put in, that should be in the operational choreography document. If that isn't the case, then I think we need to add things. So we'll go away and double check to make sure that they are in there. And if they're not, then I think we should absolutely add them for the avoidance of doubt to the next version.
Thank you. Yeah, we'll have a look at that. When will we see a view of data flows being made redundant versus new DIP messages? I think that's. I
think that was published yesterday. Yeah. So if you have a look at, I can't remember the communication. Is it design update? I want to say maybe.
The design newsletter that went out yesterday. I believe that might have it, but we'll also have a link to that in the design FAQs and make it available on the design area of the collaboration base. I know how popular that document is, and will be sort of whenever we have bilaterals with the PPC team, we can also reference that there. And so if anyone wants just to see that document immediately, just get in touch with the PPC team as well. We can send that across. Okay, next one. You're doing very well, Sean.
Thank you.
Will connection type for whole current differentiate between single phase and multi-phase?
It doesn't. No. So at the moment it's just whole current.
Fabulous. That was an easy answer. What happens to linked MPANs that don't have a matching change on those linked MPANs?
So there is a process which I spared people today. If you bear me a second, I'll see if there is a process where effectively for linked MPANs, a bit like the auto alignment process for service providers, there's an auto alignment process for connection type and segment. So again, heads wiser than mine say that you can't have if something's related, then they effectively have to have they have to share the same connection type. They have to be of the same connection type, otherwise they would be separate metering points, if you like. So effectively there is a process that will align linked MPANs from a connection type and segment perspective. So and it works. It's like an end of day mop up process, similar to the alignment of service providers. Once the change has happened on the primary, then the end of day process will make sure that was then reflected in any linked MPANs as well.
Thanks. On de-energization by the LDSO, why wouldn't the LDSO send the de-energization reading to the metering service rather than the data service?
Sorry, Marina, say that one again.
I'll start that one again. On de-energization by the LDSO,
yeah.
Why wouldn't the LDSO send the de-energization reading to the metering service rather than the data service?
Why wouldn't it send? I think it is sending it to the metering service, isn't it? Let's have a look.
Yes. From what I remember, the energisation, all updates and reads go from the LDSO to the metering
service. Yeah.
Okay. So are we happy with that?
Yes, I think so. I'm just trying to find. Yeah. So here we go. So we've got it going to he's basically the metering service is cap. So LDSO sends the details as appropriate through to the metering service, because he's the sort of owner of these data items, and then metering service flows the readings on as appropriate to the data service. So yeah, that'd be via a D10 if it was trad or advanced, and obviously over here somewhere a pub. Here we go, pub 41 if it was a cumulative read. So I think that is covered off.
Thank you. And one from Mark again. And Mark, Mark Agnew, if I relay this incorrectly, then please feel free to chip in. We've got currently co-meter and co-ES is covered concurrently in one process, so you don't send two sets of flows. Why not retain this? And Mark,
I'm not sure I understand co-meter and
change of meter and change of energisation currently goes in.
Okay, yeah. I think from a MHHS perspective, and when you kind of try and you try and apply the event-driven philosophy onto the design, we sort of see them as two coincident but separate events. So I suppose that would be my answer to that, really.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you. Just a few more, and luckily only 10 minutes left, so keep going. Did I hear correctly that a meter removal has to be received and presumably accepted before the details of the new meter install can be sent and accepted?
Sorry, Maria, say that again. Just get my head around it. So,
did I hear correctly that a meter removal has to be received and presumably accepted before the details of the new meter and install can be sent and accepted?
right, no, so you can send, so you can, the actions that I can do, I can remove a meter, I can add a new meter, or I can exchange a meter. And so I would, metering services would use the most appropriate transaction for the circumstance. So I know I don't have two separate actions of removing a meter and then adding a meter in the case of where I'm doing an exchange. That is, there is an action or an event of meter exchange that would exchange a meter. But obviously I'm not always, there may be occasions where I'm just removing a meter or I'm just adding a new one. But all three scenarios are catered for. So I don't think you'd have this, I don't think you'd have this situation where I'd have to, remove before I added, or, so hopefully that's dealt with that one.
Thank you very much. Yes, and a popular one, just that I can answer quickly. Can you please make your acronym and terminology available? If you go to the help centre of the MHHS programme.co.uk website and also the internal collaboration base, we do have a programme glossary there where you can find all the terms that you're looking for. And if you would like to add any terms, there's an option to be able to do that or request an answer to any terms. So that should be available. Just get in touch with the PPC team if you can't find that. If the connection type determines the market segment, can the mapping be published? If the connection type determines the market
the mapping will be based on ISD. So there's I can't remember the number of it off the top of my head. I want to say entity 27, but that will be a guess. Effectively, there's an ISD entity that will map valid combinations of meter type, connection type, and market segment. So yeah, that'll be available in ISD.
Fab, thank you. Do you know what's happening with existing non-half-hourly advanced time of use tariffs?
Existing non-half-hourly time of use. We could take, I suppose I think these sort of meters. I think are these meters that haven't got proper I mean, I think there's a subset of current advanced meters that you can't comms up that. So I don't know whether that we're referring to those or not. But in terms of, I mean, it's up to a supplier how he bills. So I suspect these are perhaps older advanced meters that don't have the comms. There is a bit of a discussion ongoing about those at the moment, but effectively they will still sit in the advanced segment, and we're just looking at what additional processes or support might be needed to put around those to allow sort of regular monthly or quarterly reads to come in on those. So I don't know whether that's the group of customers being referred to, but yeah.
Fine, thank you very much. One on a change of connection type. Can the change of connection type be done for a date in the past?
Well, yes, but I think what we had said on this, I'll refer to one of my purple notes somewhere. I think what we've said is that we would prefer. Yes, it can be done, and inevitably there will be situations, either because historically the data's been inaccurate or where things just get missed. So the answer is yes, but I think what we've agreed is that we would only make the change from the date that the issue was discovered. So I don't know if I rocked up at a site and realised that I had a CT arrangement, right, and it was currently recorded as a whole current, then yes, I would correct that, but I would only correct it from the point I discovered it. I wouldn't attempt to try and backdate it, into the past. So I'm not sure whether I'm contradicting myself there in terms of yes, yes, it can be backdated, but we want to keep it within the sort of time frame of discovery, if you like. So not I'm now going to set this, retrospectively back to the, months and years. It would be I effectively set it from the point I discovered it was wrong.
Yeah. Thank you. One on pub 4.5. How often is the pub 4.5 going to be made available? Will this be daily?
So again, this was discussed in the working group, and we settled on weekly. So the notifications would come weekly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Then nearly there. Did you say earlier that flows, i.e. files, will be passed through the DIP, but isn't the DIP for message queues only and not files which use the DTN?
Yeah, perhaps apologies if I wasn't consistent with my terminology, but yeah, DIPs, messages, yeah, okay, messages go via the DIP and files via the DTN. Perhaps I was a little bit slack with my terminology, so apologies for that.
Good to clarify, very helpful. Does pub 18 go back to the LDSO to confirm that registration service has accepted the proposed change?
I believe that it does, but we were in this. So it looks as if we're a little bit inconsistent about this. So I know that there were some conversations ongoing with the LDSOs about exactly what information, on what circumstances they wanted things and what circumstances they didn't. And I think it also depends partly on what other systems LDSOs have got. So yes, okay, they've got the ownership of the registration service and are updating things directly in there, but they may have other ancillary services that, say for example, an address update, that they want the update from the DIP to trigger to that pub 18 to trigger the maintenance of the address in another system. So I think it's all who gets what flow is all configurable. So I think, as you said here, it looks as if on some they're getting it, on some they're not. I'm assuming that's as a result of conversations that we've had with them, but I would urge LDSOs to feedback in the comments review if they feel that they want something and they're not, the maps don't currently show it. But what party, just to sort of more widely, what party receives what publication is configurable within the DIP, and then obviously people's ability to subscribe or not. So yeah, so that's sort of not an end of the world issue if a party wants to come forward and say, hey, I now want access, I now benefit from having access to this update.
Thank you, Sean. And then final question before we wrap up. Thank you so much for answering all of these.
That's right.
If I acquire a site with an advanced meter, which was previously non-half hourly, without a D150, D150, D149, or SSC or TPR, how will I know the switching times?
So say that one again. So I'm getting an
advanced. If I acquire a site with an advanced meter, which was previously non-half hourly, without a D150, a D149, an SSC or TPR, how will I know the switching times?
So again, I think, are we talking about this sort of really small subset of advanced? So the way advanced meter technical details are swapped on the 268, which should sort of cover all of that. I think there's a smallish subset of advanced meters, perhaps that are treated or managed, a bit more like they're traditional and to your point have, you would need a 149, 150. I think those are subject of some active, as I said earlier, those subject of active discussions within the program about what's the best way forward. And there's a number of different options in play. I mean, one approach might be to say, well, let's just, you could just badge these in and put them in the smart trad thing, but then that brings a whole load of other issues. So I think I think there's some conversations and thinking ongoing about exactly how those would be treated. But yeah, obviously, I think if we are talking about this sort of small subset of meters, then yes, you're gonna need the TPRs and the mappings to be able to operate to understand what's going on. So yeah.
Amazing. Thank you very much. There's obviously a lot going on and a lot to cover, so really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for joining, and we will put the recordings and the slides on the website as soon as possible.
Brilliant. Cheers everyone. Thanks a lot for your time. Really appreciate it. And cheers Marina. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.